I'm going to give you all a little homework assignment because I know when you leave here, you're going to want a little bit more of Randi. There is a podcast called Backyard Ecology, and she's been on this podcast twice. In 2023, she was on a panel, and it was with other prominent people who run native plant societies. She was the native plant president at the time. And this particular episode is called Native Plant Society, How Your Native Plant Society Can Help You. And I learned so much from that episode and so much about Randi Eckel that I've listened to that episode 3 times. So when you go home today, if you have a long drive or if you're listening on Zoom, Google it. If you can't find it on Google, email me. I will send you the link. Because when Randi started in this business over 40 years ago, they didn't make gardening gloves that fit women's hands. Can you believe it? And when she started in this business 40 years ago as a female scientist, really it was a male-dominated industry. And I mean, she has been dedicated to native plants for over 40 years. She's been working with native plants. She founded Toadshade Wildflower Farm that has been running for 29 years. She does a lot to promote accessibility of native plants, education of native plants, and she is a lifelong naturalist and an enthusiast of nature. She calls herself a plant nerd. And you know, I can't say enough great things about her. She is the past president of the Native Plant Society. She is the vice president of membership currently of the Native Plant Society. And when Ann Wallace and I asked her to be a part of the Wild Story podcast with her own segment, we were honored when she said yes. So it is with great joy that I introduce to you Dr. Randi Eckel, because she is fire. Thank you.
Well, I guess I need to be good after that, huh? You know, it's easier to follow a bad introduction than you don't expect anything. All right, so we're getting started a little bit late here on this presentation, but I hope I can wrap up this day of connections well for you, because I'm going to be talking about all the tiny little connections that make up our world. This is the American red raspberry. It's a lovely plant, and we prize it because the fruits are, quite frankly, delicious. They're wonderful. A lot of wildlife enjoys these fruits as well. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center calls out this plant for having special importance to native bees. And I know you're not all entomologists, but you can look at that and say, Randi, those don't look like native bees to me. Those are not native bees at all. Those are, in fact, plume moths. Now, they might be Himmelmann's plume moth, or they might be Busk's plume moth. The only way to tell the difference is to kill them, dissect them, pull out the little naughty bits and see what they look like. I didn't do that. I took pictures. But every year, we have these plume moths all over the American red raspberry, because they are leaf rollers. They come, they nectar. If you look very closely, and I know the pointer doesn't work, so I'm going to point with my very own finger, but if you look at this very closely, you can actually see they are nectaring. But they're also mating. But not this too, but others on the plant. The plant gets mobbed by them, because these insects, their caterpillars are leaf rollers on this plant. They're tiny little caterpillars, roll up leaves. You don't really notice it. They hide within, they feed, and that is what they use for a host plant. But a very close relative of theirs Trochophilus purulus. They feed on pink sundew, and they're also leaf rollers. Now let's think about that a little bit. We've got an insectivorous plant with little sticky globs on it, and you're going to be a leaf roller on that plant. How do they do that? I don't know. So many fascinating connections. All of our lands are connected. Every single conceivable piece of land. Your driveway, your backyard, the park down the street, the forest in this one state over. All of our lands are connected. And in those lands, there are myriads of creatures, myriads of living things, living in every conceivable niche. They are on the bark, they are under the bark, they are in the bark, they are in the soil, there's lichens, there's fungi, there's bacteria, there's nematodes, there's columbilans. There are hawk moths, there's birds, there's chipmunks, and they're all little bits of light living throughout in every conceivable niche. But no living thing exists in a vacuum. Every single living thing needs one or more other living things. Sort of like the Kevin Bacon game, you know? Everything is connected. Some of these connections are very obvious and we know about them. Some of them are very fine, almost invisible. Some of them we don't even know about because we haven't figured them out yet. Because despite the hubris of human beings, we actually haven't figured everything out yet, and there are an awful lot of connections out there that we don't know about. All these threads weave together to make the fabric of life on the planet, and it's everywhere. It's not just in pristine forests. It's in botanic gardens like here at Longwood. Things living and interacting and connecting throughout. And then the gardens at Longwood are also connected to New York City. This is the Broadway Mall Association putting in a planting last summer of native plants. They put in all native plants in along a section of Broadway. I don't know if Ian Olson, I don't know if you're on Zoom. Ian, it's your project. I'm sure he'd be very happy. But that is connected to this yard in Somerville, where a gentleman decided he wanted to do more with his landscape. So he took out the traditional landscaping that all his neighbors had, and he put in a bunch of native plants so that he would have a garden that did more. And he would connect then with his neighbors in discussing what he had done with his property, like Bobby Herbs did in her gardens, where she put native plants in and started conversations with her neighbors. It's connections, it's wildlife connections within the gardens, but it's also connecting to other neighborhoods, neighbors, and other parts of the world. Over the years, we, humans, have made some mistakes because we are also part of those connections. And the things that we do have ramifications. And we can break connections, and we can mend connections. It's kind of like having an argument with your neighbor, you know, and then making up again. We can help fix connections and try to make good on things that we have done perhaps wrong before. One of the mistakes that we made was one of the introduced diseases that we brought in was chestnut blight. Now, there was a blog that Kazis put out, I believe it was just this past year, where he ranted on about invasive species and said, would we just stop moving things around the world so we would have less invasive species? But a lot of these things, this is water under the bridge. We did this many years ago. It started probably at the Bronx Zoo, actually. But in the end, we lost nearly 4 billion trees. The picture in the background here is an existing American chestnut that I saw while hiking with the Native Plant Society, a small group of us. We're at Hackle Barney State Park. And there were some young American chestnuts because they keep resprouting from the stumps. Because what happens with chestnut blight is over on the, let's see, your right-hand side there. The blight basically girdles the plant and kills the plant. So in the end, what happens is we've lost the reproductive population of American chestnuts. They keep resprouting, but there's very few American chestnuts that are still producing nuts. And the nuts were so incredibly important, and there are so many creatures that relied on the American chestnut. One of the things about American chestnuts is, unlike oaks that have mast years, some year they produce a lot of nuts, some year they don't produce a lot of nuts. American chestnut was very reliable. It produced good quantity of nuts year after year after year. It's perhaps a kindness that the passenger pigeon went extinct, another mistake that we made, before the American chestnut was decimated, because the passenger pigeons really relied on it. But so did bears, raccoons, and grouse, all kinds of other things. And I don't know how many of you, like me, have got odd and old cookbooks on your shelf, but look in them. Lowney's cookbook, I think it's 1904. I've got recipes for chestnuts. You know, things to do with American chestnuts. Everybody could eat these. They were a wonderful source of food. And there were lots and lots of insects that fed on chestnuts, and we don't know who all of them were. But if we just look at the American chestnut moths, there were 58 species that we know of caterpillars that fed on the American chestnut. And 12% of those, 7 species, were specific enough that they were in peril due to the devastation of the American chestnut. 4 of those have apparently gone extinct: the chestnut ermine moth, the chestnut clearwing moth, the chestnut upin muted moth, and the Phliofagan chestnut moth. No one has seen those for years and years and years. But one of the good news about this slide is nature is resilient, and sometimes wildlife hides, sometimes in plain sight. The chestnut casebearer moth at the top there, it's an elegant little moth. They thought it had been extinct for a really long time, and lo and behold, there it was in Massachusetts in 2020, doing just fine. Chestnut clearwing moth, also known as the chestnut borer, those were rediscovered in the 80s. And in 2016, now I get to teach you a word, the American chestnut moth, Ectodemia castanea, well, there was this other moth that was on oak called Zimmermania busquella. Some entomologists decided to compare them really closely. They're like, oh, look, it's the same moth. So it wasn't, it was declared conspecific in 2016. It's like, oh, it isn't extinct, but it expanded its range so it could also feed on oak. So it's doing okay. But none of these are common yet. Some of these are extinct. And the other species that were on there, they moved off to other hosts. We don't know who was feeding on the caterpillars of these extinct species. And the reason we don't know who was feeding on those is because Doug Tellamy wasn't around to take pictures of them and take pictures of them flying back and forth. But we don't know. We don't know what other threads were broken. We don't know what place the chestnut ermine moth had other than the fact that it fed on chestnut. We simply don't know. And all the other beetles and bugs and leaf hoppers and plant hoppers, we don't know where they went. We don't know how many of them went extinct. There is the story of the large chestnut weevil, which talks about connections through citizen science. So the top picture there, from 1929, shows both male and female large chestnut weevils on chestnut burrs. The weevils with the really long noses, those are the females, because they actually go down between the spines and chew a hole, and that's where they lay their egg. Because large chestnut weevils, they're grubs, they're immatures, feed on the nuts. And there was a whole article with a Canadian naturalist, Canadian Natural History Museum. There we go, I knew I would get there. And they talked about co-extinction with the loss of the American chestnut, because the loss of the reproducing American chestnut. No more chestnuts. If you're a wildlife that relies on a chestnut, you're going to be in trouble. There was another article just this past January that said, well, we've looked really hard in the United States and we can't find this beetle. We think it's extinct. Maybe it's still up in Canada, but Canada's like, no, it's extinct up here. And then Neil Kelso, iNaturalist, he went wandering around over in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And by God, he found large chestnut weevils. They weren't gone, they were just hiding. Now, are they as common as they used to be? No. If you go to iNaturalist, it's kind of fun. There's a single dot. Chester County, Pennsylvania, and the location is obscured. I think I know where it is. I haven't gone to look myself, but I think I know where it is. But this is how we can help to figure out what's going on with some of these things. Connections between plants and insects. Insects that may or may not be extinct. Apparently not. We need to all be looking for large chestnut weevils, I think. Nature is tough. Nature is resilient. And we have made mistakes. Dutch elm disease, we brought this over, lost lots more trees, lots of elm trees. Up until recently, Dutch elm disease hadn't been spotted in either Alberta, Canada, or British Columbia. But last year it showed up in British Columbia. All Native American elm trees are susceptible to this. European elms, Siberian elms, invasive species elms, they're resistant to it. But that doesn't mean that they take the same place in our world. They don't take the same place in these networks of creatures, in these connections. One of the things that was interesting about Dutch elm disease, more so really than chestnut, is people really noticed. Everyday people on the street. It connected. The problem, the American elm, connected with the American people. Only 1 in 100,000, more or less, American elm trees is Dutch elm disease tolerant. That's not a lot of trees. But we had planted elms everywhere. How many elm streets have you been on? How many elm trees have you seen on the elm streets that you've been on? There's some university campuses, University of Delaware, Princeton, a bunch of others, that have worked hard using all kinds of methodology, both fungicides to help produce against the disease, insecticides to help produce protect against the insects. University of Delaware used to cut down between the trees so that they wouldn't transmit the disease through the roots. But elm streets in America don't really have elms on them. And this was stressful to people. But people weren't even really thinking about all the things that were living in the elms on their elm streets. All the creatures that were up there in the canopy. Morning cloak butterflies that we saw this morning, but also large elm leaf beetles. Elm coxcomb gall aphids. Many of you have heard me speak before. I'm contractually obliged, due to my experience as an entomologist, to mention an aphid in all of my talks, so now I've checked that off. Elm coxcomb gall aphids, American red squirrels, gray squirrels, question marks, banded tussock moths, these all were all among us. They were on our streets, feeding on these plants and reproducing. And when we lost the elms in our cities, any of this wildlife that had moved in amongst us, like the double-toothed prominent, which is a crazy-looking caterpillar, to be sure, these all left or had to switch to other hosts. Many of these have alternate hosts. Today, we're facing problems with American beech. I have a particular love for American beech. In my backyard growing up, there was an enormous American beech tree. And my poor parents, I was that child that did strange naturalist things, I'm afraid, as a child. Beech nuts are actually pretty tasty, I'm here to tell you. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't eating, bowls full of them, but I certainly nibbled on beech nuts more than a few times as a kid. But American beeches are iconic. They're enormous. They grow quite slowly. They grow very slowly. Before we sold my mother's house in the year 2000, I actually took a little heel cutting of a little bit because I wanted one of the beeches, and I brought it home to my house in New Jersey. Not that far. I grew up in northern Delaware. It was pretty close. By God, those things grow slow. My Lord. Other trees I've planted over the years, everybody's like, oaks grow slow. No, oaks are like way up there. The beech tree is not that big yet. But beech trees north of here have been battling a beech bark disease. Here in New Jersey, we now have the beech leaf disease, and our beech trees are suffering. So what do we do? How can we hope to manage the loss of iconic trees and the beasties that rely upon them? And how can our connections to this environment, how can we help? What is our role in all this? Well, as always, at least part of the answer has to do with diversity. Diversity of native plants, diversity of environments, which requires understanding and also tolerance. I'll get to that. So, much like the other trees I've talked about, the amount of wildlife that uses American beech is extraordinary. And this is just really talking about the ones that primarily feed on the nuts themselves, and some on the flowers. But there's over 100 different species of insect, Lepidoptera, that feed on the leaves, including the Cecropia silk moth, which is America's largest silk moth. It is enormous. The wingspan is 5 to 7 inches. And for some reason which I cannot fathom, there are people that are afraid of large moths. Why? What does a large moth kind of do? Do you beat you about the head with its wings? I don't understand. Years ago, and several of you have probably heard me tell this story, years ago on Facebook, which we all know is a terrifying place, there was a woman who posted, and it wasn't a gardening group, I believe it was Ladies of Hunterdon County group, and a woman posted a picture, and there was a Luna moth on her screen door, and she was terrified to go out the door. What was she going to do? And some of the people were like, oh my God, kill it. I was like, and then some woman, and I should have made note of who she was, completely changed the conversation. She put out this whole line of nonsense about how it was good luck and it was a visit from an angel and it was bad luck to hurt one. I mean, she just laid it on. The entire conversation changed. And I was like, well, good for you. Despite the fact that that was all nonsense, good for you. Because why are we afraid of giant silk moths? They are extraordinarily gorgeous. Now, also, in the spirit of tolerance, spiny caterpillars. I can't tell you how many people I know that love butterflies. They even like moths, but those caterpillars, they're pretty sketchy. They're just the children. They're just the children. Stop killing the caterpillars if you want the butterflies and moths. So, education, tolerance, and maybe some creative redirection of our neighbors when they decide that they're terrified of the giant moth. But the Cecropia silk moth, without a beech, a Cecropia silk moth is fine because it has a wider host range. It will also do perfectly fine on maples. It actually really likes maples. I think it likes maples more than beech. It'll feed on birches. Perfectly happy to feed on birches and wild cherries and plums and dogwoods and willows. It's perfectly happy with those other hosts. So our beeches are in trouble. The Cecropia silk moth will be fine as long as we keep it away from that woman that wants to kill the giant silk moths because they're scary. But then we've got the early hair streak. Completely different story. So much like the blue jay and the red squirrel, early hair streak relies on beech nuts. The larvae of this adorable little butterfly feed on beech nuts. Well, that's a bit of a problem if there aren't any beech nuts, aren't there? But it does have an alternate host. It doesn't have a very wide host range, but it will feed on beeches. It will also feed on hazelnut. So in this case, for this particular insect, if you also have hazelnuts, the one in the tree in the back here, this photo, this is American hazelnut in the back and beaked hazelnut in a little inset. Beaked hazelnuts are only going to enjoy it in New Jersey, really in the northern end of the state. They like it a little bit cooler. American hazelnuts are perfectly happy throughout the state. You'll never eat any of the nuts. The wildlife will get them all, but that's fine. But that's what this butterfly needs. So in this case, by diversifying your plantings, putting in more connections in your garden, you can support an insect that may be in trouble, one of those connections that may be in trouble as our beeches start to decline. And I don't know where we're going to go with the beech decline, but certainly the insects that are relying on beeches are going to start getting pretty stressed in the next couple of years while we try to figure out how to manage beech leaf disease and beech bark disease. Interestingly, now this is a map from iNaturalist, and you'll notice it is one of the strangest distributions that you'll see. You'll notice that the early hair streak, which is globally imperiled, is in New York and up in New England and up into Canada. And then it completely skips over New Jersey and Pennsylvania for reasons that I cannot even fathom and starts back up again. And I don't know, I think we need some sleuths out there in Pennsylvania and New Jersey to be looking for this butterfly. Maybe during the BioBlitz in April, somebody will manage to catch that one. A story of a butterfly that we have done great work on helping, despite the fact that some of our bad decisions led it to be in trouble in the first place, is the Karner blue butterfly. This picture was actually taken up at the Albany sand plains, as I suddenly blank on the name of that location. The only host of this butterfly is the sundial lupin, Lupinus prennis. And this is one of those wonderful situations where Americans can't seem to keep words straight in their head. It's sort of like the ragweed goldenrod story. You know, they see sundial lupin, I was like, oh, lupin, I'll plant lupin, and then they plant garden lupin. It's a different plant. I'll get to that in a moment. But these are beautiful butterflies that were really, really declining there for a while. Here's a map of both their historic distribution and the current iNaturalist distribution. So down below, that's iNaturalist, the current distribution. The populations, there were two different populations that winked out in recent years due to drought, both the Canadian population as well as the one at Indiana Dunes. I think that's a national park. They just had terrible drought years, and the lupins had a terrible year. But in the map above, which is from butterfliesandmoths.org, you can actually see the purple spots. Those are historic populations. And they're about halfway between, over near the map where it says Massachusetts there, since my pointer doesn't work. That's where the Albany sand plains are. And that's where they have a fabulous population of these, where they've really worked on restoring the lupine, the native lupine population. About halfway across the state there, right above the O and the R in New York, that's the Rome sand plains. They are restoring lupins there, but they have not reintroduced the Karner blue yet. I think that's also another population out in western New York where they're trying to restore lupins. But those are places where this butterfly used to be. So one of the reasons that it has declined is because we have planted garden lupin. How many of you read the book, The Lupin Lady, to your kids when they were little? Yeah, guess what she was doing? She was spreading invasive species all over. I read it to my children. I did. I didn't really get that point. I told this to somebody recently, and they were horrified. So garden lupin, which is Polyphilus, it's a Western species. It looks, much like how tropical milkweed does wonderful in the tropics. Yeah, California lupin should be in California. So it crosses with Lupinus perennis. Cardinal blue butterflies cannot survive on garden lupin. And when it crosses with Lupinus perennis, then those offspring can't support the caterpillar either. There's some evidence that a lot of the commercially available Lupinus perennis seed is already compromised. So, oops, our bad, but we're working on it, and we are trying to develop populations of strictly Lupinus perennis. And let me go back a couple slides. And these guys are just gorgeous, just flittering all over the place at Rome Sand Plains. I was going to try to embed a movie into this, which I completely failed at. But Sarah Harrison, who works with me, she was up there and with her father, actually, who was a big birder. She even got him to look at the butterflies. And there were just butterflies all over the place, having a wonderful time. Another great success story was the Atala hairstreak butterfly. Atala hairstreak was almost gone in Florida. It's Cuban and sort of goes south from there, but it was almost gone in Florida because it only has one host plant, and that's Kunti. It will only grow on Kunti. And some folks in Florida were like, maybe if we planted more Kunti, that would be a good thing. And they did. And it came back. That red thing in the lower right-hand corner, by the way, that's a Kunti seed pod that I took a picture of last year at Merritt Island when I was down in Florida. So it has now become prevalent enough because they've gotten people, it's like, plant the native plants in your garden. So people have been planting Kunti in their garden. So now some people are just like, but there are all these caterpillars eating my Kunti to death. Well, isn't that a bummer, So this is something where they've made choices. And their choices made a difference in recreating, expanding connections. And it wasn't one person planting Kunti. It was them planting, and you planting Kunti, and you planting Kunti, and you planting Kunti, and giving these creatures someplace to live by bringing back populations of a native plant into garden spaces, making space in your garden for wildlife. American hackberry. It's a common New Jersey tree, has wonderful corky bark, as host plant to the hackberry emperor and the tawny emperor. You don't see these things come to flowers because they like salt on my dirty hands, to be sure. They like dung. Somebody's got to, But it's a wonderful tree, and you get these wonderful butterflies that overwinter as caterpillars at the base of the tree, and then climb back up and finish their development and emerge in the spring. They're very friendly little butterflies, lovely little guys. And if you plant American hackberry, you're going to get other things. You're going to get the question mark, which is also used to be on American elms, right? We showed you the question mark before. You're going to get morning cloak, which was also American elms, but also has a couple other hosts. But you're also going to get hackberry nipple gulls. Yes, ma'am, that is the name of that. Hackberry nipple gull makers. Entomologists, I swear, have too much fun with names. The actual size of the adult insect is only 4 millimeters, and they're both important sources of food in the summer when birds go into those galls, open up the galls, and feed on the immatures, but also in the winter when these little hackberry nipple gall makers hang out on the tips of hackberry branches waiting for spring to come, because as soon as the bud opens, they lay their eggs. So all these tiny little, really well camouflaged insects sitting on the edge of the branches, well, all the birds that are wandering around in the winter looking for things, yes, they like your bird feeders, but they like protein too. And not only the caterpillars that Doug Tallamy always talks about, but some of these other insects are things that they feast on through the winter. if you plant some of these things, you will get the most extraordinary things showing up in your garden. If you have climbing false buckwheat, which is an annual vine, you may get the cross-lined wave moths, also known as the cobra inchworm. I couldn't find my picture of the cobra inchworm, but yeah, they look like these tiny little cobras, like, 1.5-inch long cobras in your garden. You might get juniper hair streaks if you have juniper. Here it is on two-leaf mitrewort. Here it is on spreading Jacob's ladder. Here it is on slender mountain mint. They get around, what can I say? So of course, I've got all these juniper hair streaks. Of course, if I go over to my eastern red cedar, surely I will find juniper hair streak caterpillars, right? No, because they're really well camouflaged. So instead, I found the juniper twig geometer. Because junipers support a lot of things. With all those berries, this is a female plant, obviously. With all those fruits, they're not technically berries, they look like berries. But these are an incredibly important food source to so many creatures. 2 years ago, we had a particularly great year of these. And I was going to take a picture, but I missed the opportunity. My husband and I were hiking along the back meadow. I think it was January. And we suddenly realized it was really loud. I was like, why is it so loud? And there were hundreds of robins gobbling down juniper berries. I was like, oh, we need to take pictures of that. Oh, well, we got to take the dog back, and we need to take the garbage out. We have things to do. We went back the next day or 2 days later. I don't know. Almost all the junipers had just been stripped. There was nothing left. There were no robins left. I was like, well, right. Should have taken the picture 2 days ago. But there are a lot of things that feed on eastern red cedar. There are cedar waxwings, of course. Enjoy the fruits of them. There's eastern evergreen bagworms that feed on eastern red cedar. There's imperial moths. That caterpillar, the caterpillar was probably about the size of my thumb, quite frankly. I found that caterpillar up in that eastern red cedar because of the size of the poop pellets it had dropped underneath. So here's a good word for you, those of you who like interesting words. Insect droppings are called frass. Hey, somebody knew that. Who knew it was frass? Yay! Oh, you've heard me talk before. And you've heard me talk before. So there were these frass pellets the size of a pencil eraser. And I was looking down, I was like, what in heaven's name is up above? And there it was, this enormous imperial moth. Caterpillar. And, that is not down below, in fact, a two-headed imperial moth. That is, in fact, a male and a female imperial moth, which have sexual dimorphism, busily trying to make more imperial moths. But there's a hollow trunk over there with a gray squirrel staring at me. The number of creatures that use hollows in trees is extraordinary. So many things on juniper, but the cedar waxwing, where does the cedar waxwing nest? Does it nest in eastern red cedars? Well, it might, but they actually really like willows. So this is a cedar waxwing nest in a willow tree. Willows, even leaving all the rest of the insects aside, are host to more than 400 species of caterpillar. That's a lot of caterpillars. But they're also host to, that is a honeybee. It is. Sorry, it was the picture that I had of honeybee coming to pussy willow, but it's also host to the willow pine cone gall midges. So if you see a willow and it looks like it has pine cones, you have not lost your mind, which is the good news. So what that is that's a little gall created by these tiny little gall midges. And you can see in the picture below the two little things that look like fingers. Those are the overwintering form of the gall midge. There is so much wildlife that uses a willow. But even, I've been talking a lot about trees, but even just in our gardens, there's so much going on in our gardens. Red-banded hairstreak here on giant goldenrod. Wingstem with, again, that's like a couple things going up there. I know there's a little beetle up in that picture, but that's also another honeybee. But then there's the northern wingstem aphid, Euryleucon rurale. It only feeds on wingstem. That's it. In the United States, we have over 2,000 species of aphid, and almost all of them are host-specific. Euroleucon rurale is only one of 2 aphids that feed on that genus, Rubicina, anywhere in the world. That's it. It's the only thing they feed on. They're not going to go to your roses. They're not going to go to anything. They're not going to go to your tomatoes. All these connections, all these things going on in our gardens. And in our gardens and crossing our borders, they don't really care where the edge of your property is and the next property goes on. Talk to your neighbors, get them to spread the word. But since I've brought up aphids twice now, 3 times now, I actually have to explain why aphids are important, because most gardeners, quite frankly, again, tolerance, most gardeners are not really fond of aphids. It takes a very special kind of nerd to really embrace aphids. This is the American poplar leaf aphid on cottonwood, Chaetophorus populacula. But who cares about aphids? How, in heaven's name, do aphids fall into the overall scheme of things? Well, I don't know. Do you like hummingbirds? Hummingbirds do not feed their young on nothing but sugar water. How many people really think they raise their young on nothing but sugar water? Did you raise your children on nothing but sugar water? Don't answer that question. I've seen some of those kids. Yeah. But hummingbirds also need protein, and they're not going to go out and skewer grasshoppers and bring them back to their young. That's just not a thing they're going to do. They go after very small insects. They love aphids. Chickadees and wrens really love aphids as well, but hummingbirds love aphids. And the picture in the background here, those were hummingbirds as the sun was going down one night, hunting through the air on tiny little midges and insects. I don't know what kind of insects they were. It was the year I broke my leg. I had my leg propped up on the deck. I was taking pictures in a distance. But it was quite fun to watch hummingbirds hunting. It's not something you think about. And then the hummingbird here nesting in a nest that's covered with lichens. Lichens which are glued in place, a nest which is glued in place with spider silk, which is stolen from spider webs. That is how hummingbirds build their nest. And they glue the lichen bits in place so that when you're standing underneath, if you look up at a tree trying to find a hummingbird nest, good luck, because all you see is lichens. And yet, I have had folks that have talked to me because they have a tree in their yard and it's growing lichens. They want to know what they should do about that. There are lichens growing on my tree. Do you know what's wrong with it? It's like, there's nothing wrong with it. They're lichens. It's natural. Do you like hummingbirds? Well, yes. I put out feeders for them. Well, good. Give them some other things that they like. They also need thin branched trees, like hornbeam trees and ironwoods. They like to nest at the branch of trees. They're not going to nest on a branch that big as my arm. That nest is a tiny little thing. And tolerate the spiders. For goodness gracious, I've got a secret for you. There isn't a spider in New Jersey that is looking at you for a meal. There are no spiders in the United States that feed on people. Now we cue in Doug Tallamy's slide from earlier about the ways that people die taking selfies. He didn't call out spiders, spider deaths. I don't think on any of those. Oh, and yes, that is a hummingbird on my hand, by the way. That was trapped in our shipping office one day, and I went in. I actually thought we had a carpenter bee in there because that happens. And then I looked at her. I was like, oh, there's a hummingbird. And it was in the window, and I went, and I don't know how many of you have tried to release a bird someplace when it was trapped, and they get very hyper. I went over, I cupped it in my hands. It was perfectly calm. And I was like, I have a hummingbird in my hand. And then I walked outdoors, and I put my hand out, and it just flew up and sat on my finger. And I had my first cell phone at the time. It was one of those little flip phone things, which was in my back left pocket. So then I had to try to get my phone out of my pocket. That's why it's not a very good picture, but I did eventually get the picture. And it flew off, it landed, it went out a couple times, kept coming back to my finger before it finally flew off again. It was a magical day, magical day. But back to, remember the red-banded hairstreak here. Where was it? There it is, red-banded hairstreak. Back to the red-banded hairstreak on giant goldenrod. Red-banded hairstreak, one of its preferred hosts is Rhus typhina. It feeds on the leaf detritus on the ground. It doesn't even feed up in the tree, up in the shrub. It feeds on the dropped leaves. So another reason, why do we leave the leaves? Because there's things living in the leaves. There are things that are relying on those leaves, like red-banded hairstreaks. And if you have Rhus typhina, you also have fabulous little bees coming to the flowers in the spring. And if you're really lucky, you're going to get this insane-looking caterpillar. Yes, that's a caterpillar. Oh my God, what is that thing? Well, it's a showy emerald, which is a really cool moth that looks like a butterfly. It has a really demented-looking caterpillar. These are connections. If we have these different plants and we provide these different habitats, yes, the red-banded hairstreak is going to nectar on your goldenrods, but it needs the roots and it needs the leaves underneath. And if you keep all that, then you might also get showy emeralds. So at the end of the day, the question that I ask for you is, what is your connection footprint? How many different connections? It's like a game you could play, really. How many different connections can you make on your property and your neighbors' properties? How much can you connect with your neighbors and convince them that, you know, you might want to try these native plants. They're really cool. And look at the butterflies that I have. Don't you want, get the envy thing going there, don't you? You want butterflies like I've got. You know gardeners are susceptible to that. But, you know, connections between the forest, between the gardens, between the city gardens, between your neighbors' houses. The future starts today. The more connections that we make in our gardens, in our parks, with our neighbors, with our friends, with other people in the native plant society and other natural societies, the better off we will be and nature will win in the end. Thank you very much. We can do a few questions.
Do a few questions for Randi?
Let's take one from Zoom, and then we can hit the
Zoom.
live audience. So Bridget Daly is asking, do the chemical treatments used as quote-unquote life support in the American elms impact the insect species that feed on them?
Well, it depends which chemicals they're talking about. The fungicides are not going to impact the insects so much. I know when I was at the University of Delaware, which, to be fair, was quite a few years ago, I did my undergraduate work there, but they were primarily focusing on fungicides that were going after the disease itself, not after the insects at the time. I can't tell you that I am perfectly up on what they're using currently. I think is Doug still here somewhere? No, he left. All right. I don't know if University of Delaware is still maintaining that stand. I know they were replacing some of them with Chinese elms and Chinese elm hybrids, which is another genetic mishmash that we can discuss another day. But as long as it's the fungicides are not going to affect the insects quite so much. And by the way, hi Bridget, because you're one of the ones at the watch party in Madison, I'm pretty sure. Is there another question? Wisecrack? Insult? Correction? Typo? Yes. So there we go.
Hi there. So I live over in Newark. My backyard is a paved lot, so I've been having to make do with pots and planters and build up over time. One of the things I've considered trying to do is like a watering station for butterflies,
Yes.
for bees and native stuff. Difficult though because I am so far away from anything else, trying to make friends with neighbors and build those sorts of bridges. But with concerns about things like, again, living in the city, things like mosquitoes and cockroaches and things like that, which I understand they have their own place, but I would like that place to be outside of my apartment, not inside. Do you have any suggestions about how to help pollinators and support insect species. As you mentioned with the aphids, they have their place because as I've said to other people, if you want ladybugs, you need to have aphids for them to eat.
You do indeed. Bob Snedeker, who was an entomologist at Penn State University, who passed away several years ago, but Bob Snedeker was, as entomologists go, a fairly famous entomologist. He was very into Lepidoptera, and he always said the best thing you can do for a butterfly is to give it a mud puddle. So one of the things that you can actually do, which will help certainly with the mosquito question, is instead of having standing water, you can put in more like a mud or even a gravel bed, so that there's just a little bit of moisture in there, because butterflies don't like to stand in water. Bees will stand on a rock, and so a gravel really works, and just changing the water pretty frequently, that'll really help with the mosquitoes. Mosquitoes take several days to breed, so if you change it every 2 days, it'll be fine. A mud puddle is easier to make and isn't going to encourage them as well. But those are probably some of the easiest ways. And the cockroaches are gonna, they're pretty opportunistic, smart little fellows. So, they're gonna like it either way, I'm afraid. But at least that'll manage the mosquitoes.
I think we have time for a few more. Anybody else have a question? Did you have a question?
I did. I had a question about the galls. I had a question about the galls.
Yes.
Specifically, actually, about witch hazel and galls.
Yes.
Because a friend of mine just pointed out that her witch hazel had this gall and she was upset about it. And I was like, it's probably a good thing. So it's more, what can I tell her?
Tolerance. Yes, Hormum aphis, wonderful little aphids. Yes, that they make the little witch's hat galls on the hamamelis. That's wonderful. Tell her she's doing a great job. Tell her that the first name, I can't remember the full name. There's actually a couple different, but that's Hormaphis, Hormaphis. Carol Von Dolan out of the University of Utah did a lot of work on those. But yeah, that means she's doing a great job. She's actually not just growing a witch hazel, she actually has things living on her witch hazel, which is a wonderful thing.
Bobby, how about Zoom?
We're good? Anything else? I know we're running over. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. Oh, wait, we got one more.
Since I'm going to take over anyway, I just wanted to ask a quick question, Randy. Randy, how can we find out more about these kind of connections?
More about these kind of connections. I think actually one of the great places to learn about these kind of connections is to get involved in bioblitzes and go on iNaturalist. Also, there are a lot of websites, certainly Toadshade Wildflower Farm has a lot of information about host plants, but there's a lot more information out there now than there certainly was 10 or 20 years ago. I should have included, which I normally do, but I forgot at the end of this, there's some really great online sources. North American Butterfly Association has really great information about host plants for butterflies. Butterfliesandmoths.org that I mentioned earlier has a lot of information as well. iNaturalist goes on beyond butterflies and moths, so you can find out a lot more that you can see in your area. And one of the great things about iNaturalist, you can look for lists by area. So it's not just listing, you're not just looking at the butterflies and moths. You can look to see what is around you, which is really quite fun. And just go out and look what's out there. And when you find things you don't know what they are, go with tolerance, take a picture, post it to iNaturalist, and see what they tell you.